We want to welcome you to our second webinar, in which we will talk about the fundamentals of user evaluation and wheelchair selection. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sara Munera, Technical Coordinator for the International Society of Wheelchair Professionals. I am from Colombia and work as a physical therapist and ISWP recognized trainer at the basic and intermediate level. I am also an assistive technology professional and a wheelchair service provider, and I'm really excited to be with all of you here today. We would like to know a little bit more about who you are. So we're going to launch a poll asking you if you're a physical therapist, occupational therapist, physician, a prosthetic or orthotic worker, nurse, social worker, researcher, instructor, or other. So please go ahead and answer the poll. And I have two screens, so I will be looking at both places while we discuss. Roughly half of you have answered the poll, so we will wait for a little bit longer. Super. So 90% of you approximately have answered the poll, so I will end it now and share with you the results. So a lot of therapists and clinicians in general, so physical therapists, occupational therapists, prosthetics and orthotics. So welcome, we have some social workers and researchers as well, and other people. So it is great that we are discussing this topic about fundamentals of wheelchair user evaluation, because I am sure it's going to be super helpful for all of you. These couple of slides are just a quick reminder on how to use Zoom. So in the Zoom, in the bottom of your screen, you will see the microphone and video buttons. You can click those to mute and unmute yourself and start your video. We will ask you to be muted at all times, unless you want, of course, to talk about something. In that case, please go ahead and unmute yourself. And there you can also see the list of participants and the chat. So when you click the list of participants, you can select your name, click more, and then rename yourself. We would like you to add your name and your country, just so we know who is here in this call, although you have been mentioning in the chat that we have people from around the globe. But now let's all go ahead to the participants list and rename ourselves. And will be Sara, and then Colombia, for example. We have someone that raised the hand. Please go ahead. Mabau, would you like to say something?
Hello. Hello, good afternoon.
Hello, Sarah, ma'am, please unmute your mic, please. Sarah, ma'am, please unmute your mic.
Thank you. Now you can hear me, correct?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you very much. So to use the chat, you can click the chat button and then make sure you're sending your message to everyone so we can all see what you have to say. You feel free to add questions to the chat at any time, and we will address it either right away or at the end of our webinar. And we are super happy to announce that we are new on Instagram. Our new account is ISWP 2015. So we encourage you to share on social media your participation on this webinar. Feel free to take pictures and post them on your stories, and you can tag us and use the hashtags Ability Meets Mobility and ISWP webinars. And maybe you know that we have done different webinars in the last couple of months. This is our second one, and we would like to know if you were on our last webinar or the first webinar that we had. So we're gonna launch a poll, and you can let us know if you were here on the webinar that we held on May 5th. I am looking at the answers coming in. This is always super excited to be able to talk with you through this way. Let's give a couple of more minutes. Super, thank you all for your answers. I will share the results now. So around 40% of you were part of our last webinar, and the majority of you is new. So Kritika just shared with us on the chat the recording of our webinar for May 5th, in case you want to look at that one. And we also want to remind you that we are encouraging you to become an ISWP certified wheelchair service provider. So if you want to be certified and need support, please email Kritika. You have her email on the screen, kritikak@wheelchairnetwork.net. So by the end of this webinar, we will be able to list the different steps to perform a hands-on assessment, to recognize the importance of context in wheelchair selection, relate the findings from the evaluation with the appropriate wheelchair of the user. So as you can see, we have a lot to cover in this our webinar, so let's begin. We should remember that we should always base our intervention on the World Health Organization 8 steps for wheelchair service delivery, and that we have to have the user in the center of our services. So as we mentioned in the learning objectives, we are going to talk about the hands-on assessment, about the importance of the context, and about the relationship between the user assessment and the wheelchair selection. So let's begin with the hands-on assessment. And let me admit some people that was in the waiting room. So when we talk about the hands-on assessment, the interview, it's also fundamental to better understand the needs of the users, the activities they do, where they do those activities, and their functional ability. We are not going to focus today on that interview, but you will need to ask about the current methods for getting around, transportation and accessibility, and any particular needs that the user may have. So when we talk about the hands-on assessment, what it means is the use of our eyes and our hands to fully understand the body of the user in order to prescribe an appropriate mobility base as well as seating system. So let's remember that the wheelchair has those two parts, the mobility base that will allow the user to move around and the seating system. And these are the 4 steps to perform an appropriate hands-on assessment. These steps include the sitting posture, getting the user out of the wheelchair and on the mat in order to evaluate the pelvis, the relationship that the pelvis has with the lower limbs, to understand if those postures are fixed or flexible, the hand simulation and the use of temporary supports to make the user as if they were on the sitting system, and then taking measurements. And we will discuss each of these in detail. We need to remember to always see the user's body, feel it with our hands to see if the posture is fixed or flexible, and record on our notes or on the clinical records what we saw and what we felt in order to remember and recall when we need to prescribe the appropriate sitting system and positioning system. mobility system and positioning system. Okay, so let's dig in on the Handson activity. The first aspect we want to evaluate with this Handson assessment is the sitting posture. So we need to make an assessment in the current equipment to see the user on his or her current wheelchair and how he or she is sitting. If we can see any postural asymmetry, and we can see also how they propel. We will record our findings and then we will ask the user to get out of the current equipment and evaluate both the user and the equipment. So sometimes it is common to see that the cushion or the backrest upholstery is more worn out at one side than at the other side. I don't know if some of you have seen that when you ask the user to get out of the wheelchair. And that is telling us that the user may be having more pressure on one side when compared to the other side. We can also look at the different angles that the equipment has, and we will see these in more details when we talk about measures. And then we can see if those angles of the sitting system relates or aligned to the angles on the user's body. Then when we have the user sitting on the mat, we can see what type of sitter he or she is. So we have 3 different types of sitters, and I draw them for you. We have a hands-free sitter. It's a person who is able to lift both arms up off the surface without changing the position of the trunk. This ability indicates that the user has voluntary muscle control of the muscles of the trunk to hold an upright sitting position against gravity. And sometimes people who are hands-free sitter require only a backrest and no other postural supports. In the middle of the drawing, we have a hands-dependent sitter. It's a person that uses either one or both hands to maintain sitting balance. And when we ask them to lift both hands off the mat at the same time, we will see that the trunk collapses to one side or the other in order to compensate for the loss of the arm support. So this means that the person doesn't have enough trunk control to keep a sitting posture without support. So for this type of sitters, we should use not only the backrest, but also probably lateral supports in order to help the user have their extremities free to perform all functional abilities. And then the last one that we have on the picture is a prop sitter. It's a person that has significant loss of sitting balance and that is unable to maintain that balance even with the use of the hands. So they will always need maximum external support in the sitting position. And that is why the sitting system for this type of people, for prop sitters, are designed to provide maximal support posteriorly with the backrest, laterally with the lateral support, trunk supports, and also anteriorly. So that's when we evaluate the person in the sitting position when they are on the mat. The next portion of the Handson assessment will be the mat evaluation. So it is super important to get the person out of the current wheelchair because it provides critical information about the need of the person and the caregiver. It also gives us information relating to how they do the transfers and how the user handle his or her wheelchair. Let's also remember that in supine, gravity is our friend, so it's not collapsing the user's body. So we are always being challenged by gravity. And when we are on an upright position, gravity is doing this to our body and collapsing us. But when we are on a supine posture, we can use gravity as our friend because it's not going to collapse the body, and we can see in that position easily if the asymmetries that the person has are fixed or flexible. So we would like to know if you always ask your users to transfer out of the wheelchair to perform the evaluation. And we're going to launch a poll question right now, asking you that. Please let us know if you always ask your users to transfer out of the wheelchair in order to perform this evaluation. I will mute myself and make sure I will unmute again. So half of you have voted. We will wait a little bit more to have some more answers. And please let us know in the chat if you have any questions, how you're feeling about this webinar, if this is new information for you. Feel free to add any comments at any time. How interesting. We had some yes and no's, and then some people changed their answers. So Andre from Canada tell us, but they have to consent to be taken out of the chair. If not, we inform them of what can and cannot be done. Yes, definitely, Andre. That's a really important portion, what you're saying. The user is always at the center of our process. So if they do not feel comfortable transferring out of the wheelchair, that's understandable, but we definitely need to explain what are the things that we will be able to do, and then what are the things that we won't. So I will share the results of the poll with you. So most of you do take the user out of the wheelchair, and some of you don't. So thank you so much for your response. And we are sure that now that you know how important it is, you will ask the user to get out of the wheelchair. We have some other comments. Emmanuel is learning. Great, that's amazing. Great refresher. I'm not a provider. Do we do this evaluation before the assessment? When you perform the assessment on a couch, is very good. You are able to get the necessary results. Definitely make sure that the surface is appropriate, that is flat, and that allows the user to be sitting in an upright position. And I'm not sure, Sabi, what you mean when you said about before the assessment. So this is part of the complete assessment. The Handson assessment has these 4 portions. So the way I put it here is the way where the order in which I usually do it. So after we look at the user in the sitting on the mat and evaluate if he can sit, if he or she is a hand-free sitter, hand-dependent sitter, or prop sitter, then we look at the pelvis. And for this, we ask the user to lay down on the mat on supine and evaluate the pelvis. So we will see if it can be on a neutral posture on the 3 planes of motion, which are sagittal, and I will introduce you to my friend Flexi. So we will look at the pelvis in the 3 planes of motion: sagittal, that is viewed from the side; transversal plane, that is viewed from the top; and frontal plane, that is viewed from the front. So we will see if we can passively align the head, shoulders, trunk, and legs after we have aligned the pelvis. And we can see if we can passively move the pelvis in these 3 planes of motion. So this is a reminder of those 3 planes of motion and how the pelvis would look like when we see it from these 3. So we have one question here: when we will get evaluation after getting the wheelchair or before? So this evaluation will be before we prescribe the wheelchair. So this one is the second step on the WHO steps, which will be the user evaluation of the study of the user. And here we have the pelvis from the front, from the side, and from the top. And we will have to place our thumbs in the anterior superior iliac spine that is represented on the slides by a star. And then we will wrap our hands around the pelvis to better understand its position. So in Flexi, I will put my thumb on the anterior and superior iliac spine and then wrap my hand around the pelvis of the user. And this way, of course, this is a really small pelvis, but on a real size pelvis, it will be something like this. And this way, we can see if we have an obliquity, anterior pelvic tilt, posterior pelvic tilt, or a rotation. You prescribe according to the results of the evaluation. Exactly. the evaluation reports on the prescription. Exactly, that's correct. Thanks. Let me put Flexi here. So we will then need to evaluate the relationship that the pelvis has with the lower limbs. And give me 1 second because we have another question. What is the reference for the sagittal plane? So the sagittal plane, and this is super interesting to remember it this way, the sagittal plane is when we see the pelvis from the side. So sagittal from the side, so we will have anterior pelvic tilt or posterior pelvic tilt on the sagittal plane. When we look at the pelvis from the front, it's in the frontal plane, and we can have obliquities. So one side of the pelvis higher and one side lower. And when we look at it from the top, that will be the transverse plane. And in here, it looks a little bit weird, but we can have obliquities on that plane of motion. So once we understand how the pelvis is positioned in those 3 planes of motion, now we will evaluate its relationship to the lower limbs. So we will first measure the trunk to thigh angle. And here I have Hami to show you that. So the relationship between the trunk and the thigh that we usually call as well the hip angle. And we will measure it with the neutral pelvis in order to see how the pelvis relate to the lower limbs. So we will first measure this angle, and we need to make sure the knees are flexed to evaluate it. So as you can see it on the image that we have the user sitting on a supine position, and we flex the knees in order to evaluate what angle can the user have between the trunk and the thigh, having an appropriate position for the pelvis. So that will be our first portion of evaluating some of the angles of the user. Because if the user can only have, let's say, less than 90 here, and we sit that person in a wheelchair that has a 90-degree angle, then the wheelchair user is not going to fit on that wheelchair appropriately. So that's why we need to evaluate this angle, the relationship between the trunk and the thigh. And after we do that, we need to evaluate the relationship between the thigh and the lower leg. So this is the thigh to lower leg angle. We also call it hip flexion with knee extension. And during this evaluation, we will see if the user has tight hamstrings. So remember, and Hami has hamstrings here, so you can better understand it. Remember that the hamstring's origin is in the ischial tuberosity, right here on the back, and it goes all the way to the tibia, right here. So if you modify the angle between the thigh and the lower leg with tight hamstrings, look at what it's going to do to the pelvis. It's going to create a posterior pelvic tilt. So that is why it is super important to get at least these 2 angles during this evaluation. Now put Flexi here and Hami here, and we will come back to those later. So it is also fundamental to understand if the posture is fixed or if the posture is flexible. When we have a fixed posture, we need to modify the seating system so it can accommodate that posture. So let me show you here with Flexi. So let's say Flexi has a pelvic obliquity and he sits on a flat surface. So if he sits on a flat surface, look at what happened with the spine and look at where the head will be, right? And the body is super smart and it would not allow us to look at this with the head tilted all day. So it will compensate and create an scoliosis. So if we know that posture If we know that posture is fixed, then we can compensate that by adding a little bit more of cushion on this side. And now look at how the rest of the body reflects that. So if we have a flexible posture, would be the opposite. We can add a little bit more cushion under this side in order to compensate and have the pelvis in a more neutral position. So it is really important to understand if the posture is fixed or flexible. So please go ahead and share in the chat if you also evaluate this relationship between fixed or flexible. As I continue to the third part, which is the hand simulation. So after we fully understand the user's body, and let's remember that this is not a fast and easy to do process. We need to evaluate how the user is sitting on the wheelchair, ask that person to get out of the wheelchair, evaluate how they're sitting on the mat, then how they are laying down on the mat, evaluate the pelvis, the relationship that the pelvis has with the hips, with the knees, and then see if the posture is fixed or flexible. We need to do all those steps in order to fully understand the user's body, and then simulate with our hands and with towels or sheets the posture that we want the person to have on the wheelchair. So once the person is sitting upright, we position the pelvis in a neutral posture. If possible, if it's not possible, then we just leave it as it is and put towels below the pelvis, just as I mentioned with flexi. And then we give support to the trunk with our hands. We can further assess if the person needs external support to be able to sit against gravity. We can also use these temporary supports that I just mentioned, such as blankets, rolls, or sheets, and align the user body according to the needs. And this part is really important because it's really going to give us the information that we need in order to understand what the seating system may be. So for example, we mentioned a user that is not able to have a trunk to thigh angle of more than 90, so it's less than 90. And for example, in the Handson assessment, we will have to add towels on this portion as temporary supports, and that will later on be modified in the seating system, either to a real support that is going to be here, for example, having the cushion with slump, or having the sagittal angle of the back of the cushion on this position instead of being flat. So with this information, we are then going to modify the seating system. Remember to see the user's body, to use your hands in order to evaluate it and understanding, and then record your findings so you don't forget about all of what you have seen. So the last portion of this hands-on assessment is taking measurements. That has been an important impediment to develop the field of wheelchair seating because of the variation in the use of terminology that relates to the postural measures of a seated individual and the measures of the seating support surface. So standard terms, standard definitions, and standard ways of taking measures have been lacking. And it has been really difficult to communicate the clinical postural needs to the different stakeholders, which may be the manufacturers, the clinicians, the providers, and so on. So this is an amazing clinical application guide that contains appropriate terminology and explains specifically how to take all of the different wheelchair measures. I have one comment here in the chat, so give me 1 second. We have to raise one side of the cushion for balance, the weight bearing. Exactly. Thank you so much. You got it. So please take a picture of this. This is a super amazing book. You can download it free online. it was developed by the paralyzed with a paralyzed veterans of America grant. So it's available for you all. And I know some of the terminology that I have been using, such as the tied to trunk angle and tied to lower leg angle, are new, maybe new for some of you. If so, let me know in the chat. And that terminology is based on this book. So we need ways to standardize the way we talk about wheelchair measures and the way we take wheelchair measures. Oh, that is a really interesting question. So can you show us the wheelchair assessment sheet which you follow? Of course. So we have the WHO, the World Health Organization, basic and intermediate evaluations, but I have modified the intermediate one, and that's the one that I currently use. So we can definitely share with you those resources by the end of this webinar when we share the recording as well. And Jackie has one comment: we don't tend to say fixed anymore, and someone's first posture can continue to deteriorate. Exactly. Yes, that is right, Jackie. So probably the posture does not come all the way to neutral, but it is able to collapse more towards the other side. That's correct. Can you let us know, Jackie, what will be the term you use to describe non-flexible towards neutral posture? Please let us know, and we can use that terminology as well. And Andre, we have applied this content in our clinic. It has helped us so much. That is amazing. I love taking measurements, so it's great that it has worked for you as well. Can we have the link of this free book? Sorry, I did not catch it. Yes, Carlos, I will. This is the name of the book. You can go ahead and take a picture of it. Otherwise, we will definitely send this as well to all of you after the webinar. So Jackie says, reducible or non-reducible? Correctable or non-correctable? Wow, that's amazing. I need to write that down. Super, thanks, Jackie. So we always take linear measures, and we take those with the measurement tape and with the caliper, but it's super important to remember one thing, that the user body is different from the wheelchair. There are two different things. So that's why we have linear body measures, for example, the shoulder height, and then we also have linear support surface measure, for example, the back support length. So I don't know if that's something common for where you work, but where I work, it's common for us to refer as the back support length when we are talking about the user's body. That is not the back support length. That is the length of that is the shoulder height. So it's super important when we are taking these linear measures to separate those and understand that we have the body measures and that we have the support surface measures. And we also have, aside from those linear measures, we also have to take angular measures. And those angular measures should be taken on all of the three planes of motion that we just discussed. And once again, we have angular body measures, and we have angular support surface measures. And we have two more comments on the chat, so I'll look at them. ATH Colombia says, thanks as always, you're very welcome. It's super exciting to do this because we all learn together and like create knowledge together, so that's always great. It will be okay to raise one side of the cushion from relieve the pain of ASIS, and we describe sitting posture in relationship to the pelvis. Yes, that's correct. We describe the sitting posture as it relates to the pelvis. And for the other question that we have, I think it's very specific to to the condition of each user. So I'm not sure how to answer to your question, but if the user for some reason needs that side of the pelvis to be lifted, then it is important for us to do so, and also to follow up with the user to see if that worked for them or if it didn't. When we adjust the pelvic position posture, shall we correct the neutral position or make the patient sit in the most comfortable position with slight adjustment? That is a really interesting question. So sometimes we like people to be sitting like super symmetrical, and for some reason we aim for that, but we need to remember that the most important thing is the function, right? For the user to be able to do all the activities that they want to do, and to be able to do it in a position that is appropriate for each individual. So everyone has a different body. So the neutral posture, it's not something we should look at for in all users. We need to understand the user's body, and in order, and based on that, prescribe the appropriate sitting system. So I'm not sure if I answer your questions, but it's always super subjective to each individual and each user. So we just mentioned that when we talk about the angular measures, we had angular measures for the body and angular measures for the support surface. And in those angular measures, we have relative angles. Those relative angles relate one portion of the body with the other portion of the body. So here we have the thigh to trunk angle, the thigh to lower leg angle, and the lower leg to foot angle. And as you can see, all these three angular body measures are on a sagittal plane, correct? Because we are looking at the user from the side. And we also have absolute angles. The absolute angles relate one portion of the body either with the vertical line or with the horizontal line. That's why they are called absolute, because they relate to an absolute measure, which will be the vertical or the horizontal. As an example, here we have the sagittal trunk angle. So it will be the sagittal, looking from the side, sagittal, the angle that relates the trunk with the vertical line. And Andre has just shared us some great resources on this subject, articles and videos. Thank you so much, Andre. This is amazing. You have that link on the chat. And we have angular body measures. So you guess it, we have angular support surface measures. We have relative angles relating one portion of the wheelchair with another portion of the wheelchair. So for example, seat to back support angle, seat to lower leg support angle, and lower leg to foot support angle. And once again, this is all looked at from the side. So these are all sagittal angles. And we have absolute, once again, relating one portion of the wheelchair with either the vertical or the horizontal line. And as an example, here we have the back support sagittal angle, relating the back support with the vertical. We have some more questions. How to consider the angles to wheelchair? So we have a lot of different ways to consider these angles. The most important thing is for you to know that these type of measures exist, that we can use them in order to fully match the wheelchair with the user body. So I personally use the angles when I ask the person to get out of the wheelchair. I measure these, particularly these two angles, the seat to back support angle and the seat to lower leg support angle. Mainly those two, and then I evaluate those corresponding measures on the user's body, which will be the thigh to trunk angle and the thigh to lower leg support, the thigh to lower leg angle, in order to see if those in the wheelchair are appropriate to those with the user. And it's super common for me to see that the seat to back support angle is on a 90-degree angle, but that for some reason, the user is not able to sit at a 90-degree thigh to trunk angle. So the wheelchair angle is like this, and the user angle is like this. So it doesn't match. The wheelchair user is not going to fit properly on that wheelchair. So I use the angles in that point, and then when I prescribe or recommend the appropriate wheelchair, I explain which angles I need on the seating system in order to relate to the user's body. Perfect. So this is a super short summary of all of these amazing angles and information. So we have measures. We have linear measures, those we usually take, and those linear measures can be either from the body or from the support surface. But we also have angular measures that can be angular measures of the body of the person that can be relative or absolute, and angular measures of the support surface that can be relative or absolute. And Andrea is telling us in the chat that they measure wheelchair angles with a protractor that is used by woodworking crafts. That's amazing. Is it because it's a little bit bigger than the usual goniometer, Andrea? I usually use the goniometer to measure this. Perfect. So after all this, that was all we wanted to share regarding the hands-on assessment, which, as you can see, is super important in order to later prescribe the wheelchair. And please let us know with the following poll that we will launch if you would like us to make another webinar talking in more detail about any of these topics. So we can talk in more detail about the sitting posture. We can talk a little bit more about the user out of the wheelchair and on the mat and how that evaluation will work. We can talk a little bit more about the pelvis and hip screen, about the difference between flexible, reductible, and non-reductible. Did I remember that, Jackie? Hand simulation and use of temporary supports or taking measures. Yay, thanks. And Jackie, it's saying that she's old, so I have to use a goniometer with large numbers. Amazing, a super big goniometer. That's perfect. So I will stop the poll now, and I will ask, I will share the results and ask Kritika if we can, let me do it. I can take a picture of this just to make sure we have that for our next webinars. And most of you would like us to talk about hand simulation and use of temporary supports and taking measurements. That's amazing. Thank you very much. And we also want to know if you prefer a live webinar like this one in which we can interact a little bit, or if you would prefer a recorded one that you can look at anytime you want. So please let us know in the poll that we just launched. Thank you, Carlos. Obrigada. So, thank you all. I will end the poll now. And most of you would like a live webinar. Lovely. I like live webinars as well because we can interact. That's always great. And we only have around 10 minutes left, but we wanted to talk. We wanted to talk about the context and how fundamental it is when we are going to evaluate wheelchair users. So what it means to understand the context, it means to understand the environment in which the person is going to use the wheelchair, but also to understand what products are available on our context, how the service provision works, how the personnel works on that service provision, what are the different policies that we have in place in order to work with users. So when we are going to evaluate the environment, we're going to evaluate the home of the person, the school or work, the places they go to during the recreational activities. We need to understand what difficulties they have moving around, what difficulties they have, or the measures of the sizes of doorways, turning spaces, table heights, because all that is super important for us to understand the different portions of the wheelchair. So I'm just looking at a lot of messages in the chat. Now you're very welcome. Please do not go. We still have 10 minutes. That was just the final part of the Handson assessment, but we have a little bit more on context. We have one question regarding if we get certificate after the webinars. And I know Kritika will be able to answer that better at the end, but what we are aiming with these webinars is for all of you to become certified wheelchair service provider. So if you are already a certified wheelchair service provider, this webinar can work as your recertification. And if you're not, we encourage you to get certified, and we will give you a discount code at the end of the webinar, so you can do so. So please do not leave us. No, thank you all. Amy says, I like the webinar with recording for follow-up, or if unavailable to me. Yes, that's an amazing suggestion, Amy. Thank you. And we definitely will post this on our YouTube channel and share it to all of you. So besides from that environment, we're going to also understand how the user moves around. So transportation, if it's public, private, accessibility, and how the funding will work, who is going to pay for that wheelchair. And for the user assessment, we need to think about the wheelchair selection. And this is a super important thinking process. This is one of the things that I enjoy the most, because it's related what we just learned in all of those steps of the Handson assessment and kind of translate that to the wheelchair and the seating system. So it is super important to remember that we need to fully think about what we just learned, understand that, and then we need to relate the sitting posture to the seating system. The functional ability of the user to the mobility system. How is the person going to move the wheelchair? We need to relate the body distortions and the hand simulation with the postural support devices, and the body measures with the measures of the support surface. So as you see, the wheelchair service provision is a process that builds upon different steps. And today we just briefly mentioned two of them, the assessment and the prescription. And I wanted to share these as well. These were all of the references or documents that I used to create this webinar. So if you're interested in learning more about any specific topic, you can take a picture of these resources. And Carlos, if you're still around, the PBI Assistive Technology Partners, that's the reference for the guidelines on how to take measures. So I will share the discount code in 1 second. And Eka is mentioning that it would be great to have a specific topic in pediatric wheelchair or for children with disability. That would be amazing. Thank you so much for that suggestion. Lovely. So to ensure appropriate user evaluation and appropriate wheelchair selection, we need to have trained personnel. So I want to thank you all for your commitment to improve your knowledge to be a great wheelchair provider. The discount code for those of you interested in becoming certified wheelchair service provider is ISWP Web 2. We have it there on the screen, ISWP Web 2. And you can contact ISWP Research and Training Coordinator, Kritika Kandeville, at her email that you also have on the screen. and it's kritikak@wheelchairnetwork.net for more information on how to become a certified provider. And please join us in our third webinar that will be held in September about the fundamentals of wheelchair fitting. Thank you all for joining us, for sharing with us your knowledge, what works for you, where you work, the way you do things. It's always amazing to be part of this great community. Thank you all. Thank you, Raul. Thank you, Nazem. Thank you, Bai.